Welcome. Throughout 2024 on the Ogham Grove channel, we're going to explore which Celtic goddess or god corresponds best with each tree of the Ogham. It's going to be an interesting exploration with no fixed dogma. So with each tree, we'll explore a variety of gods and goddesses that may be appropriate for each tree. The first one will be on the 30th of December, which is for Ellen of the Ways. But under that, any other goddesses or gods that correspond with the birch tree, we will contemplate. Ellen lends herself to other sovereignty goddesses of the land, which is rich in Celtic lore, of course, and deer goddesses of the reindeer, which is throughout Northern Europe. And even Ireland has a deer goddess motif with the fairy spirit Scythe, who is the love of Finn McCool. So we'll be looking at deer goddesses and their relationship to the birch tree and to the land. But this video is to also just approach the topic of Celtic goddesses and gods. And we're going to look at three primary sources of information. The first source is archaeology. Now, there is something which I call the big conundrum or the big discrepancy, and it's that archaeology tells one story and medieval Christian writers tell another story. So the second section is mythology. So first of all, we have solid archaeology and what that can show us. And then we have mythology, which is all of the written stories, which were written down in Ireland from the 9th century onwards, and in Wales from the 10th and 11th century onwards. But the stories were written down by Christian scribes. And pretty much in all of the stories, the gods and goddesses are turned into human beings. You know, they're humanized. And yeah, it's a Christian spin on things, you know, so you have to read between the lines. But also the big conundrum is this, that archaeologically, there is evidence of Celtic gods and goddesses, like Cernunnos and Rosmerta and Nemetona. Lots. Brigantia. And there aren't any, as far as I'm aware, stories written in Ireland or Wales about the archaeological deities. There's no stories written about Cernunnos. There's no stories written about Rosmerta or Nemetona or Brigantia, you know. So the deities we know that were venerated have no written stories. And in contrast, when the stories are written down and we have gods and goddesses like in Ireland, the Dagda and the Morrigan and Danu and Brigid, you know, that there's no archaeology. There's just stories written by Christian scribes who turn these deities into people. It's the same in Wales. You have Gwydion and Arianrhod and Blodeuaeth and Llai, you know, that they are obviously Celtic deities in origin, but under Christian writers of the 10th century and the 11th century and the 12th century, they're turned into people, culture heroes, you know. So we will balance all that and we'll look at all of that and we'll try and make sense of the archaeology and the Christianized stories. And then a third aspect will be modern day visionary work, people that are working with the inner world in the modern world, and the experiences they have communicating with various gods and goddesses, whether it's supported by what the Christian scribes wrote down in Wales and Ireland or not, or whether it's supported by archaeology or not, so 3 valid pools of information, and we'll be measuring it all and contemplating it all, and trying to apply it to each of the trees of the Ogham. So before we look at Celtic gods and goddesses, I'm going to give a PowerPoint presentation. But before we do that, we need to look at the word Celtic and what do we mean by Celtic. So the word Celtic means different things to different people and different periods of time, but it was first used in the 6th century BC, or at least that's the earliest evidence, by the Greeks. The ancient Greeks referred to all northern Indo-European people as Keltoi, from which we derive the word Celtic. So Celtic is a big topic, and it also doesn't mean anything. By that I mean, for instance, you could talk about Native American traditions and Native American beliefs, but it doesn't mean anything because you're not talking about a specific tribe. You're not talking about the Hopi or the Lakota people or the Apache. So each tribe has their own way and their own beliefs and their own perspective on the spirit world and their own individuality as a people, even though you can loosely say Native American tribes. All of those different tribes have sovereignty over themselves. And it's the same with the Celts then in Europe. So there were many different Celtic tribes. Even in Britain alone, there were about 30 different tribes, and there were a good 15 to 20 tribes in Ireland, and in Gaul must have been about 20 tribes. And yeah, it's vast. So in a way, Celtic doesn't mean a thing at all, although it is used to describe culture and artwork and maybe burial modalities, but it's not specifically a type or a race of people. Rather, it's a type of culture, and that's the Northern European culture of the Iron Age. Now, back in the autumn and winter of 2015, the British Museum put on this exhibition called Celts, Art and Identity. And I was fortunate enough to be able to go along with some friends of mine, including Alan Royce, who's taught me a lot of star lore in the mystery traditions. But the British Museum in this exhibition explained how Celtic culture covers a vast landscape, really, from the Far East, north of Turkey. You've got Thrace, the Thracian people, and that's important. So even further east than Greece, is the Celtic culture, the Eastern Celts. Nowadays, as explained in the British Museum, a lot of people think Celtic is specifically Irish or Scotland, Northern Britain, or even Cornwall and Brittany are Celtic lands. But actually, Celtic culture spanned from the Atlantic coast all the way to the Ukraine. It's a vast area. And as I mentioned, many, 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 many different tribes, and all the tribes unique to their own ancestral heritage, and also nomadic tribes, people moving around. So they weren't always fixed to a location, you know. So whilst Native American tribes are individually unique, that you know there might be some commonalities. So you can say, generally speaking, Native American tribes have a medicine wheel. You know, that's a fairly common motif amongst the tribes. Or maybe have their sun dance ceremonies, but not all tribes do. I think it's more in North America than Southern America. So it's the same with the Celts. You know, as a culture, they span from the Atlantic coast to Ukraine, and the artwork is that. You know, we call it the Latin culture or the Hallstatt culture. It's just archaeological terminology grasping at straws, really. Probably the most iconic thing in the British Museum exhibition was the Gundestrup cauldron, which they had borrowed for the exhibition. Normally, the Gundestrup cauldron is permanently on display in the Museum of Denmark. So, you know, this wonderful, massive silver bowl is the biggest silver object that archaeology has ever found of the Celts. And it dates to maybe the 1st century BC. They don't know for sure. And it was found broken up, dismantled, because it's made of various plates of silver stuck together. And it was found in Denmark. However, it's not from Denmark, and I'll explain that in a little while. Yet it is part of the Celtic world. Now, as I mentioned, I was fortunate enough to be at the museum with my friend Alan, and to be up close to the Gundestrup cauldron with the bits of star lore insights that we had. Almost straight away, we were able to decode various patterns on the Gundestrup cauldron, and I've talked about these in various videos already. You know, like it depicts scenes that are equal to stories told in the Mabinogion with the Cauldron of Renewal, and also the Three Birds of Rhiannon. You know, it depicts a goddess figure with 3 birds above her. 2 are above her, one's in her hand, and falling down in front of her is a hunter and hound. You know, that's obvious star lore, which I've explained elsewhere. So Alan and I, already primed, were able to appreciate that even though this silver bowl was found in Denmark in the 1st century BC, it sang a song in harmony with Welsh stories that were written down in the 11th century AD. You know, that's mad. You know, that's over 1,000 years. Anyway, there are other intrigues with the Gundestrup cauldron. For instance, it depicts elephants. Quite clearly, on either side of the female figure, there is an elephant, you know. So this is actually not from Denmark. You know, you don't get elephants in Denmark. It is treasure hoard that the Celtic tribal people have either traded because it's ornate silver and valuable, or they've stolen it from somewhere, yet its motifs are Celtic, even though it depicts elephants and hyenas and winged griffins and stuff. You know, these are very unusual. Now, the style of silverwork, scholars consider to be most closely resembling that of Thracian. So I'll come back to this map. Thrace is on the far right-hand side above Turkey, where it says Eastern Celts. That's Thracian. So they are Celtic and they're close to the Mediterranean. And who knows, you know, somehow from either North Africa or India, elephants have found their way into the symbolism used on the Gundestrup cauldron. And somehow that cauldron, Celtic, traveled all the way from Thrace, north of Turkey, to Denmark. And the Welsh stories collaborate with it. You know, the cauldron of renewal is depicted on there. It is a strange thing too, is that even on Pictish art, Scotland, northern Scotland, of maybe like the 7th century, there's this strange character which they just called the Pictish beast. But it's acknowledged by many. Some people call it the Pictish elephant. You know, so you know, these are just intrigues of the Iron Age, or not even with the Pictish. It's not Iron Age. It's after the Romans have been and gone. You know, that there's a memory of this long-nosed beast. You know, even if there aren't elephants in Scotland, the Picts have inherited that imagery from somewhere. Anyway, so that's a quick glimpse as into what is Celtic. Because of the Celtic revival in the Victorian times, people like A.E. and, you know, W.B. Yeats and Fiona MacLeod and people like that, their emphasis was Ireland, was Irish lore, with some acknowledgement of Wales and the Welsh material, and that Cornwall and Brittany are Celtic too. So that reinvigoration of interest into all things Celtic was known as the Celtic Revival. However, with the modern world and modern archaeology, we're still in the early days of rediscovering Celtic culture, and it is the entirety of Northern Europe, as far east as the Ukraine. We've still a lot to learn, but now a quick glimpse at archaeology. Okay, just a quick glimpse at some photos of Celtic gods and goddesses of old archaeology, looking at the Neolithic, you know, the Neolithic to the Bronze Age, and then the first statues and inscriptions of gods and goddesses of the Celtic people turn up at the end of the Iron Age, and what we call the Romano-Celtic, you know, so the tribes of Celts have been conquered by the Roman Empire and absorbed into the Roman Empire. And their priests, their druids, were annihilated, apart from in Ireland and northern Scotland. But they were allowed to continue worshipping their gods and goddesses. So there's some small mercy in that. Under Roman occupation, we have a lot of Romano-Celtic depictions of Celtic gods and goddesses. So that's something anyway. So we can have a look at that. There's a few inscriptions, but like I said, no written stories. But very quickly, looking at things with the Ogham Grove, we're looking at year cycles, we're looking at star lore to help us understand how different gods and goddesses could correspond with each tree. So each tree has a position in the year, so therefore it relates to the seasonal cycle of the stars. One way of measuring that is the zodiac, but that's not the only way of measuring it, but it was the common way in the ancient world. So when you get to Romano-Celtic times, there's hybridization going on of Celtic gods and goddesses and Roman, Greek, esoteric astrology or astronomy, but astronomy and astrology was something that the Druids loved and the pre-Celtic people loved. So Neolithic people and Bronze Age. Probably the most famous example of that is Newgrange in Ireland at Brúnaboyne. Now, it's an amazing site, and it was deliberately built to receive the sunlight at winter solstice. And as I'm recording right now, it's actually winter solstice eve. I'm only about 6 or 7 hours from the exact moment of winter solstice, and tomorrow morning the sun's light will shine into Newgrange. Now, it's amazing to realize just how very old Newgrange is. Just as a quickie, roughly it was built around 5,000 years ago. The given date, as best as archaeology can tell, is 3,200 BC. Now, to put that into perspective, that's a few hundred years before the pyramids at Giza are thought to have been built. Although I know there's lots of conspiracy theories that the pyramids are much older than what established archaeology thinks. But as far as standard archaeology goes, Newgrange is older than the pyramids at Giza. It's 1,000 years older than the estimated time of Abraham, the founder of Judaism. So it's 1,000 years older than Judaism. And it's 3,000 years older than Christianity. Round about 3,200 BC, so it's round about 5,200 years ago. Now, it's not unique in the sense of observing solstices. That's thought to be true with Stonehenge as well. Newgrange is old. Even Glastonbury Tor, although it's a natural hill, evidence suggests that the east slope was sculpted or carved so that the sun at winter solstice can be seen to roll up the hill. It's a bird's eye view. And what's strange, so Newgrange is Neolithic and Bronze Age, and when was the Tor sculpted? Well, no idea. But in the top left-hand corner here, you can see the lake village, the Iron Age Celtic lake village of Glastonbury, and it was deliberately positioned in the water. They built a lake village in the water rather than be on the dry land, in alignment with that winter solstice sun roll at Glastonbury Tor. So even though the Bronze Age people of Newgrange and other places are not technically speaking Celts, they're actually pre-Celtic. They were there before the Celts expanded outwards, or not. Celtic is a culture, so it might just be that the people that were here adopted so-called Celtic artwork and pottery and so on. So like everyone on the world now has a smartphone or a laptop, so computer technology culture, but many groups of people And that's how Celtic is. You know, it's a culture, it's artwork, it's metalwork, it's pottery, shared from tribe to tribe to tribe, and that's as vague as it is. So prior to the Romans, the nasty Romans conquering Celtic Europe, there isn't much evidence of statues or inscriptions of gods and goddesses. If the Celtic tribal people made statues, possibly they were made of wood and have thus deteriorated, or if they were made of stone, they've been broken and lost, or what have you. We don't know, you know. So the artwork of gods and goddesses that I'm going to show you now are, for the most part, Romano-Celtic, but that's 3rd century and 4th century AD. So this famous one is known as the Rheims altars from Gaul, round about 300 AD, 4th century. But look, details I want you to pay attention to is it's antlered Canunus, and below him is a stag and a bull. Now, we've mentioned this before in other videos, so I'm not going to go over it, but I just want to draw your attention to this, the antlered god with a stag and bull. So on the Gundestrup cauldron that was at the British Museum from Denmark, there is the famous depiction of antlered Canunus, and to the left of him are a stag and a bull. So as we discussed, theoretically, the Gundestrup cauldron comes from Thrace, far away from Gaul, you know, but the same symbolism, the same motifs of the antlered man and a stag and bull. Now, Canunus is just Latin for the antlered one or the horned one. It's not always antlers, you know, but any horned one is Canunus. Kern means horn. So Canunus, the god of the horns, the horned one. It's not unique to Canunus, of course. These two figurines are also from Romano-Celtic Gaul, and they're women. They're women with antlers, or they're goddesses with antlers. There's no inscription, so we don't know what their names are. A pretty good guess would be Nemetona, she of the Sacred Grove. And on the far right here is an altar from Bath in Britain, Romano-Celtic times, and it says Nemetona on it. Here's a close-up, a little bit blurry. But reading downwards, it actually says Lucetio Mars and Nemetona. So that's saying that Nemetona, the goddess, was with a god called Lucetius Mars, or shining radiant Mars, and Nemetona, like a lord and lady together. So it's the goddess of the grove with a male companion, the radiant shining Mars. Who that is in Celtic deities, we don't know who radiant shining Mars is. Possibly Lugus, but it would be guesswork. Also from the same area as that Nemetona inscription, there's these 3 mothers, and the middle one making the W shape of the constellation of Cassiopeia, the mother goddess, in the middle of the night sky. So there is in the YouTube channel, the Ogham Grove, the most popular video is the Great Mother Goddess of the Celts. And in that video, I talk about Cassiopeia as the throne of the Queen of Heaven, of the Great Mother Goddess, and so on. That Celtic goddesses were married to gods, some sort of sacred marriage, but the gods tend to be Roman rather than Celtic. So in Gloucester, there is a depiction here of Rosmerta, the mother goddess. Rosmerta means great provider, the distributor, the great provider. And she has a ladle and a bucket. So it's very Ceridwen stirring her cauldron, but probably is to do with the ladle being Ursa Major, the Big Dipper, and the stirring of the night sky. But she's paired with Mercury, you know, the Romano Mercury with his caduceus and winged helmet and stuff. So who was the Celtic Mercury? Well, that's a big debate too. And the popular option amongst people that study it is Lugus. Lugus is the Celtic Mercury. These are things to debate. I'm not going to get too tangled up with it, but these are things we will look at throughout the year. These are just glimpses. This is a wonderful figurine from Gaul. It's a version of Brigid, a version of Brigantia. But in Gaul, they would say Brigitte. So here's Brigitte, and on her helmet, she has a swan. Wonderful. You know, it's a lovely variation of Brigid, Brigantia, Bridie, and now Brigitte in France with her swan helmet. Romano-Celtic. Another depiction of the goddess with the ladle, except for instead of a ladle, this time it's the Big Dipper as the Great Bear, and she is still sitting on her throne as the Queen of Heaven, but with the Great Bear instead of holding a ladle, you know, but it's the same star law. You know, once you understand the motifs of the constellations, like the most famous one for Down in Wales, or Danu in Ireland, the constellation of Cassiopeia is Llys Down, the court of Down, and it's a throne. And so goddesses sitting in thrones, more often than not, are going to represent the great mother goddess sitting at the center of the night sky, either with the Great Bear or with the Big Dipper stirring her cauldron. Here's some lovely Romano-Celtic goddesses upon thrones. So there's no inscriptions, so don't know what their names are, but the one on the left, lovely primitive looking, is from South Wales. I think she was found in the Caerleon area, I think, Chepstow, around that area. The one on the right is from Gaul. Looks a lot like the Virgin Mary and baby Jesus, but it's pre-Christian. You know, it's a mother and child, of common enough motif throughout the ancient world with Isis and Horus and so on. Some of the iconography then of Romano-Celtic Europe, incredibly complex, incredibly detailed. The one on the left, as memory serves, was found in what's now Belgium. And there's so much going on there. At the bottom, there's a snake and a lion and Crater, the wine mixing cup. Next to the snake is a cockerel. And that is all relative to the story of Ceridwen consuming Gwion back. She turns herself into a hen, cockerel, at that time of year between Crater, the wine mixing cup, and Leo, the lion, is the exact time of year when the mystery traditions began and when Ceridwen consumed Gwion back before he became Taliesin. That's just the bottom of that panel. You know, moving up, there's three figures around a table or basket. Looks like there's a single fish on it. Further up, there's a female figure with horses beside her. Could be Epona, you know, could be Rhiannon, the horse goddess. Right at the top, there's a sunshine deity, possibly Apollo or Mithras, riding his chariot through the sky. And then right in the very top corners are dragons, you know. So this is just one bit of Romano-Celtic art from Belgium. On the right-hand side is the sunshine god, Apollo, Helios, Mithras, whoever, radiant shining Mars, surrounded by the zodiac, surrounded by the heavens. Now, this is a recurring motif, that the stars, the zodiac, the year wheel, is a big part of understanding deities. So here's a couple more examples. You know, so on the left is Apollo surrounded by the zodiac. Got some interesting motifs going on, like there's a Leo the lion head on his chest because Leo governs the heart, and there's a serpent wrapped around his body and he's got wings. But basically the zodiac is around him, so he's the lord of the heavens. And on the right is another deity with a zodiac. This is Mithras, and this is from Hadrian's Wall in Britain, you know. So this is Romano-Celtic times, lots of influences from across Europe, and further. Mithras is a Persian influence, although adapted by Roman legionaries, but lots of mysticism in there. From Hadrian's Wall, 3 goddesses of the waters, or the wells, or well maidens, you know, and this idea of nymphs or eternal female spirits of the land, of waters, of waterfalls and springs and pools and lakes, carried on from Romano-Celtic times right up until the 17th century, where there's the Polyolbion maps, where all of the rivers of Britain are shown as naked ladies. That is, eternal goddesses of the river nymphs. Here's an intriguing figure, again from Gaul, from about the 3rd century, and looks a lot like Odin with his 2 ravens, you know. But the descriptions of Odin for the Norse mythology of Northern Europe come many, many centuries after this figure. This is a Romano-Celtic 4th century figure from Gaul. He has carrying apples. He's got a crooked staff and a dog. And the way the wooden staff is crooked, it sings of it being oak, because oak branches deliberately or specifically are that kind of zigzaggy, kind of lightning bolt movement form to them. So he's a wayfarer, he's a traveler with a dog and an oak staff, and he has a bird on each shoulder. You know, just like Odin being a grey pilgrim or great wanderer, you know, this is already there in Celtic Europe. And this figure's not unique. There are other depictions in Gaul of a bearded man with a bird on each shoulder, you know, dating to 4th century, pre-Christian. Now, a lot of these statues and carvings are broken. They've been smashed and vandalized. As well established and well understood that the early church actively destroyed paganism. So what we have here are the remnants of spiritual vandalism, you know, that went on for centuries. Ancient pagan sites were reused as foundations for Christian churches. It's a big topic, really. How weird do you want to get? You know, this is Pictish now. This is northern Scotland. This is a bit later. This is kind of 7th century Pictish artwork. And these are the same culture that had a kind of elephant carved in stone in Scotland. But look at these 2 figures, 2 bird-headed characters with bird feet and they seem to be pecking at the eyes of a small head. It's pretty grim, it's horrible. But what is it? I've no idea. It's just a glimpse that there's so much we don't understand about ancient belief systems or mysticism or esoteric ideas and stuff, you know. So I'm not sitting here as someone who knows everything. I'm sitting here as somebody who wants to explore and hopes that others will explore with me. And the methodology that we're using indirectly with the trees is the sun's ecliptic, which is the zodiac. So understanding star law and how the stars are a key to understanding some of the old gods and goddesses and seasonal patterns and so on. So just before I wrap up with the archaeology, there's this wonderful head from Gaul. It's thought to be Lugus, a triple Mercury god. Now, we're going to go now into mythology and the written stories. And here's a sobering thing then. So in the 2nd century AD, in Gaul, Roman writers described Gallic gods, Ogmius and Lugus, 800 years, 700 years, 800, 700 years before Christian scribes in Ireland wrote about Lu and Ogma. So Ogmius and Lugus are archaeologically sound, and then 700-800 years later, Christian scribes write about Lu and Ogma. So there's a big gap. There's a 700-year gap, but there's some sort of similarity there that, you know, Ireland holds a position unique in Europe in that it was not defeated by the Roman Empire. All of the other Celtic lands, apart from northern Scotland, the Picts with their elephant, were defeated by Rome. And their gods and goddesses turned into Romano-Celtic artwork. But in Ireland, there is no Romano-Celtic artwork because the Romans didn't get to Ireland. But what did happen is Christianity got to Ireland around about 4th century, 5th century with St. Patrick. And then a few hundred years later, 700s, 800s, the Christian scribes start writing about their cultural mythology, their cultural stories, and they write about Lu and Ogma and other gods and goddesses of the Tuatha De Danann, but they're not complete gods and goddesses to those Irish Christian writers. They're culture heroes, or they're humanized, really. You know, they're people that claimed Ireland from somewhere else, just one of many invasions, you know. But of course, we understand really that the Tuatha are deities. But we now go into the world of mythology and the writing of cultural stories. Okay, so then now we come to mythology of gods and goddesses, and really this is about the gods and goddesses that most modern pagan people, druids and Wiccans and witches and so on, and I'm included in that. I'm a bit of a druidic witch, I suppose, or a witchy druid. But the gods and goddesses that so many of us consider profoundly important to our individual spirituality, Irish gods and goddesses and Welsh gods and goddesses all come under the term Celtic. The bitter pill to swallow is that most of them come from the written sources. In Ireland, as I said, from the 9th century, 10th century onwards, deities like Dagda, Morrigan, and Lugh, and Ogma, and Brigid, and so on, they come from written stories written by Christians who have turned gods and goddesses into human beings, culture heroes, and often Christianized in their dialogue. You know, that the stories, the gods and goddesses have dialogue with Christian exclamations in them. It's the same in Wales, you know, Rhiannon, Blodeuwedd, Branwen, Gwydion, and so on. They're all Celtic Brythonic gods that have been turned into almost medieval characters, almost in a fairy tale or a pantomime. And some of it is frustratingly even much more recent than the early medieval. For instance, the story that gives us Ceridwen is very late. It's 14th century. There's no evidence of Ceridwen before that. It's called the Haynes Taliesin, or the Book of Taliesin. And you know, Ceridwen is a human being, a witch who uses, and I quote, the books of the astrologers. You know, so she's a human woman with a little library of astrological books who then goes collecting herbs. You know, this is a 14th century story, and it's hard to imagine any Iron Age Celtic goddess with books on astrology. You know, very much a thing with the zodiac of the classical world. But it's stories written down by Christian scribes long after Europe's been Christianized. Now, one of the early ones for Britain is this chap called Geoffrey of Monmouth, and he wrote a book called The History of the Kings of Britain. It's not a history at all, it's a work of fiction. He has characters in the Iron Age having dialogue with each other. Now, how can that be history? It's the imagination of a 12th century writer. And the phrase they use for Geoffrey Monmouth and for medieval Arthurian stories, especially in France, all of the French Holy Grail stories, they use this euphemism, turned into romance. You know, so they claim to have an ancient history which they've turned into romance. You know, so that just means they've made it into a story. And so that's what Geoffrey of Monmouth did with his History of the Kings of Britain. There were scraps of historical references, you know, like the Historia Brittonum by Nennius, and Geoffrey of Monmouth turns it into romance. And quite clearly, looking at the various kings in his History of the Kings of Britain, a lot of these kings are Celtic deities, like Leith of London is a type of Lugus, and so on. And Geoffrey of Monmouth turns characters into human beings, and with that then are the very first references to Avalon, the very first reference to the Lady Morgan, who eventually becomes not just humanized but demonized by the French writers as Morgan Le Fay, the wicked, wicked Morgan Le Fay. Originally in Geoffrey's story, she's a good lady, a noble woman to whom Arthur was taken once he was mortally wounded in Avalon. A whole load of complexities in there. Arguably, Morgan and the Irish Morrigan are one and the same, just humanized and diminished and then demonized into Morgan Le Fay. These are complicated topics and too much to cover here. But in the fictional writings of the Christian scribes, there are elements of classical star lore. Even in the Arthurian stuff, the round table represents the night sky and the circle of the heavens and so on. And even the story of Uther, King Arthur's dad, Uther becoming the Pendragon, is to do with star lore of the constellation of Draco the dragon, that's depicted here with this Merlin image. And the pole or the staff connects the center point of any territory to the pole stars. I've already done a video on the YouTube channel, the Ogham Grove, called Pendragon, goes into all of that. But it's just an example of how ancient esoteric star lore finds its way into fictional stories turned into romance. You know, the beloved Holy Grail stories turned into romance. And actually it's the same then with Wales and Ireland with their indigenous deities. Just as one example, branch 2 of the Mabinogion tells the story of Bran and Branwen and the cauldron of renewal, which is depicted on the Gunderstruck cauldron. And as much as it's a story, you know, the gods and goddesses are turned into human kings and queens, trying to protect their land or intermarry with the sovereignty of Ireland. It all goes terribly wrong. But within that story, there's information about places. So it's shown on this diagram. Grassholm Island is an island in the west, entry point to the other world. The Tower of London and the White Hill, very important. Branwen's grave in Anglesey, part of that story. Even the Lake of the Cauldron in Southern Ireland is part of that story. So whilst Welsh and Irish gods and goddesses are turned into romance, turned into fiction, turned into human beings having adventures, they often shed light on place names, on landscape features. Famously in Ireland, there's the paps of Anu, you know, the breasts of the mother goddess, Danu. So it's just an example of reading between the lines of the Christianized stories. You can start to be Sherlock Holmes and start to figure things out. What's it actually saying about the landscape? And what evidence is there of pre-Christian information about these stories? And it is there, you know, you have to rummage around and there's too much to go into, but I'll share what little bits I found over the years as we go through the year. But like, for instance, in the 2nd century AD, the Roman writers in Gaul describe Ogmius and Lugus. As I said, 600 years before the Christian Irish writers describe Lu and Ogma. So it's a kind of, you read the medieval stories, you realize that gods and goddesses are turned into human beings. So then you can then go looking at what little the Romans and Greeks wrote down, because the Druids didn't write anything down. So you have to read what Greeks and Romans said about Druids and Druid beliefs, and what few gods and goddesses get named, and then go back to the medieval stories and try and figure out all the missing bits. It's like a jigsaw puzzle with half the pieces missing. It's really frustrating. I hope that with some knowledge of star lore, by comparing archaeology with the stories, and by looking at the rest of Celtic Europe, which we're still at the beginning of that journey, what iconography, what statues, what stories are there in France and Belgium and so on, all the way to Ukraine. There's a lot to discover. I'm not going to solve it all in 1 year, but we can start looking at the jigsaw puzzle pieces. And that's the intention with the year ahead. So now, the third part of this, just call it visionary, that could be shamanic journeys or meditating or having a dream. And that's the most important thing. Now, there was a time when the British Isles and Ireland were covered in the last ice age. There were no Homo sapiens there with their gods and goddesses. There was just ice and maybe a few small families of Neanderthal hunting woolly mammoth, and whatever they believed in. So there was a point when the very first modern day people, Homo sapiens, went to the British Isles and to Ireland. And what happened? They encountered gods and goddesses, or they took gods and goddesses there with them. We can never know what really happened. But if psychic, intuitive, imaginative, spiritual people go to a land, they then become part of that land. And as being part of that land, they will start to attune and listen and dream of that land. So there's two ways of looking at it, that people could have taken gods and goddesses with them to Ireland and to the British Isles, or they may have gone to Ireland and the British Isles and interacted with the spirit world and learnt about the goddesses of the land, the goddesses of the rivers, the gods of the land and the gods of the hills, all of that. What were the witches or the druids or the wise people doing? Just taking their own beliefs with them as they settled on the virgin landscape? Or did they connect with the spirits of the land? And these interesting things, and a lot of modern day pagan spirituality is about making a connection internally with the spirit world, so that you have an affinity with one goddess or one god or another. And part of this journey with the Ogham Grove is to find 20 gods and goddesses for yourself, a pantheon in your inner temple, in your inner grove, that each tree represents a god or goddess, so that you've got a pantheon of 20 gods and goddesses in your astral grove or your psychic realm and so on. So here's the thing, there would have, I don't know how to keep saying it really, a lot of people will have a go at doing visionary work, having a vision, having a dream, making a connection with a god or goddess that they're interested in. But a lot of people will also be shy of sticking their toe in the water, shy of receiving imagery or receiving information that contradicts that which has been written down, you know. The thing is, the spirit world is alive right now. It's waiting to be interacted with. That reconnection between human beings and the spirits of the land, or the spirits of the ancestors, or the spirits of the star realms, or the gods and goddesses, however you want to get your head around it. What makes it Celtic? I don't know, just having an affinity with the spirits of the Celtic lands, I suppose, you know, but that's, again, it doesn't mean anything Celtic. It's just tribal people of Northern Europe. So every river, every mountain, and the sun and the moon and Venus, and so on, you know, they're all spirits perceived by shaman, for want of a better word, druids, witch doctors, medicine people, visionaries, and so on. But the encouragement is that we will look at archaeology, we will look at the mythology, and we will look at modern day visionary interactions. And it does not matter if the visions received contradict that which has been written down by Christian scribes in the medieval days, turning deities into human beings. You know, the Mabinogion isn't a gospel, and the Book of Invasions of Ireland isn't a gospel. You know, they're just books that were written, you know, a long time ago. And we're not meant to be carbon copies of some sort of fixed idea. You know, those, yeah, hard to explain what I'm trying to say, but encouraging people to work on the inner world and make connections with the spirits of the other world, you know, and it's alive here and now in the 21st century, in 2023, and soon to be 2024. You know, that connection with the Fae, that connection with the goddess, that connection with the spirits of the land is what's really important, whether it contradicts written stories or not, you know. And, you know, it might just shine light on ancient archaeology that has had no stories written about it, you know, Canunus, Rosmerta, Nematona, you know, she of the sacred grove is not there in any Irish story or Welsh story. So we need to be inspired by the past. We need to be intelligent academically about what's archaeological evidence, and we need to know what the written stories say. But we also need to boldly go forward, like Star Trek, and as much as you can explore outer space, it's time to explore inner space, you know. And more than anything, I guess that's my driving influence, my driving ambition is to delve deeper and make a connection with the spirit world, no matter how surreal it may be. You know, your visions are never wrong. What you perceive in your vision work is never wrong. Nobody can ever tell you, oh, you're wrong, your vision was wrong because blah, blah, blah in the Mabinogion, or blah, blah, blah written down in the 10th century. No, no, all of those written stories have human error and human contrivance and religious contrivance. And you must be bold enough to delve into the other world, the perilous realm, with all of its illusions and delusions. But if we share our individual insights, we might find that there's a commonality, that there's a general truth perceived by many, and a rose by any other name is still a rose. So whatever name you give the goddess in her many aspects are valid, and the spirit world talks to you in this moment in time. And, it knows a lot more than we do. So just to recap then, looking ahead for the whole year, we're going to look at the evidence of gods and goddesses from ancient sites, Neolithic and Bronze Age. Don't give us any inscriptions or names of gods and goddesses, but they do give us alignments with stars and solstices and equinoxes and symbolism, like the Triskelion at Newgrange, and spirals and lozenges and stuff. So we can look at ancient astronomy, star law, symbolism, seasonal cycles, and then that can be perceived as personified into anthropomorphic personifications. That is, the sun becomes a deity, or the moon becomes a deity with arms and legs and a name. Then we get to the Romano-Celtic era, where we've got solid archaeology of gods and goddesses, which I've shown a few of. Then the medieval stories, what Christian scribes remembered or turned into romance during the medieval days. And most importantly, what do we do with all of that? How do we use all of that to help us navigate the spirit world, the inner world, when we do our visionary work? Big stuff, important things. So the first session is on the 30th of December. We'll be looking at the birch tree and the goddess Ellen of the Ways. For more information, you can go to my website, which is my name, Yuri Leitch, YURILEITCH.co.uk, and there's a page there called Zoom sessions, and it has all the dates for the year ahead, 2024. And we'll look at different deities as we go throughout the year. So on the 30th of December, Ellen of the Ways, but also the deer goddess, the antlered goddess of Northern Europe, and also whether there's any other gods or goddesses that will pertain to the birch tree. So trying not to have any fixed ideas, but also trying to find a face or deity to pin to each tree. That doesn't sound right, does it? That each tree is a sacred, living representation of a god and goddess. And so the whole Ogham Grove is a pantheon of gods and goddesses inside you, with you, holding you, supporting you, that are always there, even if it's just 20 ancestors, however you want to work it. An interesting exploration. So, see you there.